I would like to note there has been this family photo or biggest photo gathering event outside. I presume that a number of people might be at that event and might try to come big in one big group, which of course then will overwhelm security. So I think we'll start about 5 minutes late to allow people to actually. Okay, so if any one of you was participating and there was no big crowd floating in, then I take this as a sign that we should actually get going. So my name is Axel Michaelova. I'm from University of Zurich, co-organizer of the event together with Liechtenstein. And we have Liechtenstein represented here by Sven Braden, who will talk here, of course, on behalf of the Life Climate Foundation Liechtenstein. So before we start getting into the speakers, I will give a short introduction in why this event here. Okay, let's hope that this technology configuration is actually working. Yes, it seems. It has also some COP fatigue. So why do we have this topic, which at the first glance might look a bit unusual, because philanthropy is normally not a topic that is discussed at the UNFC negotiations. We have this topic because we felt that so far we have an issue that climate finance is actually a bit of a silo culture. There is a number of different options for international climate finance from public sources. You see on the right-hand side of this graph the various sources. This, of course, is in $1 billion, so it's big numbers. And you see, of course, that a number of the various climate finance options are not visible on the scale, because they may have 100 million or 500 million. And here, of course, you only see the really big players, essentially like GCF. You also see that the multilateral players are dwarfed by the bilateral players, ODA, Fast Start Finance. These, of course, have been really big. And you also see that the market mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol have also been really big when it comes to the overall volume. What one should note is that if one sums up the NDCs, they ask under the conditional parts for about $350 billion of public finance flows per year, which of course is about 3.5 times as much as the famous $100 billion figure. And of course, those of you who've worked in the field know that the $100 billion figure also suffers from certain definitional problems. So I would probably think it's probably more 4 or 5 times of the amount of support that actually would flow. So that, of course, already gives us the scale of the challenge that we face. And we then have the second part of the challenge, which is that we have, as I said, silo culture, that the mechanisms and the climate finance institutions often exclude each other. For example, the Global Environment Facility always had an iron curtain against CDM projects. Or what we now see with the Green Climate Fund is that it asks CDM project developers who submit projects to the GCF to actually cancel the CERs if they get GCF funding. So of course, this, in my view, is a risky tendency, and we, of course, need to try to work against this. And of course, I would think many people don't think about philanthropies when they hear the term climate finance. Therefore, I think it is very important to raise the issue that actually philanthropy can play a significant role and also leverage other forms of finance. With that, I would like to come to my overall conceptual thinking about how climate finance integration could happen. And I want to use a term from yesterday's Marrakesh Action Proclamation, where it is said we need to increase volume, flow, and access to finance for climate projects. Well, of course, I hope that climate project means projects that address climate change mitigation adaptation. I didn't really like the term because it's a bit fluffy, but let's hope that it means that. And of course, how do we now deal with this? And here you see the Economists' marginal abatement cost curve, where you look at mitigation options and that are stacked according to their mitigation cost. And of course, you see the left-hand part of the curve, negative. These are the profitable options that are normally not mobilized because there are technical barriers, there are information barriers. But if these barriers are removed, these are taken up by the private sector and undertaken. So of course, these are the classical case. They need some maybe technical assistance for barrier removal, but afterwards they can be unilaterally financed. Then you have those options that have a positive cost, but where the cost is below the price of carbon market credits. And these are, of course, the best candidates for the new mechanisms under Article 6.2 and 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. But then, given that we have a very ambitious Paris Agreement, we need to go beyond that. So the market alone cannot mobilize the mitigation that we need. And that's where we now need integrated climate finance. So we need revenues from market, we need multilateral climate finance flows, we need bilateral, and we need philanthropic. How they combine in the end doesn't matter that much. What is important is that they can combine to actually mobilize the high cost options. Of course, this nice utopia will only work if we get significant demand for credits under the markets, because otherwise, of course, the part that needs to be done by the multilateral and bilateral climate finance gets bigger, and then we get back to the conundrum that I mentioned earlier, that we have so much demand for climate finance, but only relatively limited supply of that. So with that, I would like to set up the key questions for today's event. So first question is, in all the discussions about public climate finance, there has been the debate, how can we ensure that our interventions are actually efficient? And philanthropic institutions, of course, have been struggling with this for quite some time and have found interesting answers. And I think they may be able to make a difference here, and we can learn for other finance institutions. The second question, and Sven will go into some detail on that. How can we synergize public finance and philanthropic finance? Can there be, let's say, co-benefits that harness these various forms? And this will be, let's say, the first part of our event, where Sven and Anna will provide their experiences and plans in that sector. And then the second part of the event will look at an instrument which is currently quite fashionable called green bonds. And the question with these green bonds is, how can they be designed in a way that is consistent with the environmental integrity? I just come from another side event which discussed environmental integrity of market mechanisms. And of course, this also relates to climate finance, because if climate finance goes into business as usual projects, then it is wasted. And the second question then relating to these green bonds is whether they can, for example, help to save stranded CDM projects or other assets that have suffered from the carbon market crisis in the past, or could they even be used to mobilize mitigation policies on a national level? So these are the questions we would like to discuss here, and I would then now like to pass on to Sven for his introductory presentation. I'll just get your slides up.
Yeah, thank you, Axel, for this interesting introduction. And I'm happy to give you some of my remarks regarding experience from Liechtenstein, how philanthropy fits into climate finance in our view. A quick information about the foundation I'm working with here. I have two hats on. I'm officially negotiating for Liechtenstein. Our topics are transparency and markets in Article 6. But now I'm here as the Deputy Director of the Life Climate Foundation, a foundation that is driven by the most relevant financial associations in the country. We have just set up a subsidy program for electric cars and started a feasibility studies of fuel cell technology. But we are now aim also in bringing the philanthropic sector of Liechtenstein into the climate finance stream. A quick note about Liechtenstein itself. I don't know if you all are familiar where Liechtenstein lies. It's between Switzerland and Austria, in the heart of Europe, and a population of almost 40,000 inhabitants. So it's a very small country. I think we have 900 inhabitants less than the Principality of Monaco. I've checked that yesterday. GDP is 5.49 billion US dollars in 2012. Our emissions are 250,000 tons per annum. That's just as a starting introduction. Experience in climate finance. Here we started in 2010, following the political promises we made in Copenhagen in the so-called Fast Start Finance stream, and provided new additional funding, which was really approved by the parliament, and then launched some heavy discussions, because the decision of granting additional finance was made in the wake of the financial crisis and corresponding governmental cuts in budget. So it was quite a challenge to get these funds approved. And then these challenges led us to the conclusion that we cannot rely that we only stick with the taxpayers' money. So we wanted to go into corporations with the private sector, and we took a look in the project we supported in climate finance so far, and identified some interesting aspects with regard to PPP projects. So,
sorry, I just note the slides are relatively small and I see many people sitting in the back. So if the whole crowd could move a bit in front, then you benefit from seeing the slides in a better fashion, and also we have a better atmosphere. This room is much too big, of course, for an event on the last day, but I would really invite everyone to move towards the front to have a better viewing experience, because otherwise, yeah, it is not good for you and not good for us.
Thank you, Axel. The slides were not intended to provide the information, just to show that there are a lot of projects supported by the Liechtenstein Climate Finance Program. So the information just sums up some of the projects we are engaged in. So we screened the project under the Climate Finance Program, and then we identified that there are a number of projects where we already worked with philanthropic foundations. And the board of the Life Climate Foundation, having in mind that the future of ensuring a constant providing money of climate finance to the UNFCCC process is challenging, they decided to look deeper into the issue, or into the possibility of having an institutionalized corporations with the philanthropic sector in Liechtenstein. So I skipped the project. So we started to look into the issue, and in 2014, the Association of the Liechtenstein Charitable Foundations came up with an interesting number. They made a survey asking the foundations in Liechtenstein how much money they spread around the world and also in Liechtenstein. And they asked about 1,200 philanthropic foundations, and they came up with an interesting number. In 2012, they provided funds worth 110 million US dollars all over the world. I mean, 90% international, to cultural projects, to environmental projects, to social projects. The interesting aspect of this number was that only 81 foundations participated. So if 81 foundation participated, then the number of allocated funds is probably a lot higher. That led the board of the Climate Foundation to the conclusion that we really should launch a deeper cooperation with the climate, with the philanthropic sector in Liechtenstein. And when we started to work on that project, we wanted, or we identified a set of goals that that we may achieve, and realized that there is a possible win-win situation for all stakeholders here. So first of all, from a governmental perspective, this offers the opportunity to provide a strong leverage of governmental climate finance contributions if we work constantly with the philanthropic sector. This cooperation also leads to a strong focus on impact aspects, because most of the foundations we talked so far, they are really impact driven. So that is why many of them are also a little bit reluctant of working together with a big multilateral organizations, because of some overhead workload and the bureaucracy around it. And of course, depending on the foundation involved, and there are some big foundations in Liechtenstein, like the Medical Foundation or the Onassis Foundation, the Hilti Family Foundation. They have expertise through their in-depth network around the world. So we can rely also on these experiences. Another aspect from a domestic point of view is that by this cooperation, we also can strengthening the interaction of foundations in Liechtenstein, which is not so obvious, because if they don't have a forum where they regularly meet, it's a bit there's a bit of the danger that they just do everyone their business on their own, and there might be some synergies that are getting lost. Of course, we also support the idea behind the philanthropic engagement in general. And last but not least, it's about promoting the philanthropic, or Liechtenstein as a hub for philanthropic vehicles. So the next steps, we identified these goals, and the next steps are now the implementation of a joint project as a pilot, where we want to test the institutionalized approach of a long-lasting PPP cooperation between the state, the government, and the foundations, the philanthropic foundations. We have a project in Peru that is the deployment of a photovoltaic devices and storage capacity in the Amazon region. The project costs are not that huge; it's about $100,000, but we want to start little by little, and using this project to showcase or to test how we can design the future relation between the government and the foundations. So we will work on some generic and most likely replicable memorandum of understanding, including criteria for cooperation. Here we have to keep in mind the varying interests of the stakeholders. We have the interests of the foundations. As I said, they are impact driven, and this has to be reflected in the MOU. And what the representative of this foundation told us as well is that they want to see us as the government. I'm now speaking for the government, to maintain a certain balance to ensure that the state does not transfer its obligation to the private sector. That is some sort of danger that appears from time to time when state and private foundations work together. From a point of view of the state, we have to ensure the transparency regarding the origin of the financial resources or the financial means. We need to know where the money comes from. This is also can be sometimes an issue for foundations and the families that are behind the foundations. And another point, and that's something where we have to look in the next year, is to ensure the compliance with reporting obligations from a state perspective. The obligations or the rules of these obligations as set out under the UNFCCC guidelines. So with this final remarks, I want to close here. We are at an interesting point of a process, and I'm confident that this can become something much bigger. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sven. Are there any questions for clarification? Okay, if that's not the case, I would invite Anna Young from the Children Investment Fund Foundation. Anna, of course, is involved in one of the biggest foundations that is existing in the world, and one which has been really active in the climate change field for a number of years. So I think really with very interesting experiences. I'll just get your slides up.
Just making sure that good afternoon. I was going to say good evening, but it feels like on the last day of the second week of. So thank you for joining. So I'll just make a really quick introduction about CIF, the Children Investment Fund Foundation. We were created in 2004 by a hedge fund manager based in London. So it's a private philanthropy. And our mission originally was to set up to improve the lives of children in developing countries who live in poverty. And this hasn't, changed. And I think in his view, he's quite young. He's 50 years old, and he's a very wealthy man who puts a lot of money into the endowment. So our job is to solve problems, not to give grants. So every single grant process that we go through, it's an investment. For us, it's an investment. We care about impact, and I will talk a little bit more about that. So in terms, we're probably 12 years old as a foundation, and the climate change program started after 2009, after Copenhagen. And so if you look at our portfolio now, the biggest portfolio is still on the Survive and Thrive, that looks at nutrition, health, education, and dewarming programs. And the climate change program started, well, it's younger, but we have 7 years of track record. And so our annual accumulated giving now is roughly 220 million. So we are probably the second or third largest private philanthropy working in the climate space. And if you think about it, it's actually not a lot if we consider the size of the problem that we're facing. There's a lot more, there's a slide that I didn't put it here that I saw a while ago that there's a lot more money going into, arts and other things, which is super important, than in climate change. So we are also doing a lot of effort and bringing other foundations to invest into climate and to tackle climate change. The reason why we work on climate change, because it's due to the intergenerational justice. Children are the most vulnerable group impacted by climate, and so what they inherit is the decisions that we make today. So we are the champion for children, and as the world's largest philanthropy that focuses on improving the lives of children, we support ambitious and bold programs to improve the lives of children today, but also tomorrow. So the way we see the climate team is that we're working for a better future for tomorrow, for the children of tomorrow. And I think what we in every single event when we talk about CIF, we kind of like to put that climate is not an abstract debate, right? It's a kid that is born today will be 14 in 2030. So in a lot of things, when we talk about the modeling, 2030, 2035, 2050, it seems really, really far away. But when we put into the reality of a child today, born today, it's really within their lifetime. So everything that we talk about, the decisions that we make today is really within the lifetime of, people, just all the millions and billions of children that are born. And obviously, I don't have to tell you all the impacts that climate has on food, on nutrition, on health, and education. So I just want to share this slide with you, and why, again, our target is aiming for the well below 2 degrees, which is 1.5 degrees. This is a UNICEF graph. It's a UNICEF report published in 2015. And it shows the number of children impacted by climate change with all the things that, nutrition, health, water, sea level rise. In the 4-degree world, which is we're kind of on, the number of children is 1.5 billion. In the 2-degree world, which we're aiming, is 750 million, which is half of that. And if we kind of are more ambitious and we go to 1.5 degree, then it's 150 million. That's a tenth of, you know, in terms of new children impacted. So for us, it's within our mission to go for the well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5. We know it's really difficult, but it's, you know, something that we have to do for the children of tomorrow. And that's why we're so sometimes quite aggressive about some of our programs, and people kind of think, well, you know, the Children Foundation, we should be quite cuddly, and we are very cuddly because we care about children, but we're also quite aggressive and bold and about evidence and, you know, measurement, because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So our theory of change is really demonstrating that low carbon transition is possible in both developing and developed country. And we try to aggregate action to achieve scale. So what we aim for is really always for scale. And we, you know, some of the interventions that we do is accelerate learning through networks, we generate incentive and benefits for leaders, and then disincentive and penalties for laggards. We try to mobilize public and private finance and create the race to the top. Our ultimate theory of change, what we aim for is always policy change and implementation. This, in our founder's view, who's very, very active in the foundation as well, he believes that people will only do things if there's policy and if they're made to do things. So you can either sue them, fine them, or make them do through regulation. We may agree or disagree about it, but that's his belief on and then that's kind of in a way underpins everything that we do. And so our value is, well, I want to share that and it will explain a little bit about our due diligence process, right? We are the champion for children. We aim for systemic change. And I know that everyone talks about systemic change. It's really difficult, but we're trying. We try to understand the best lever entry points. And I think our role as philanthropy is to be on the vanguard. Our job is to go where a lot of other bilateral donors can't go because of political issues or, you know, other kind of decision. And so we can take risk, and we can also tackle tough problems that sometimes we can't do. So for example, we have this program that we support, the Client Earth, which is an organization based in UK who sued the UK government for non-compliance of air quality directive, and we won. So those are the kind of things that we do. And we know that there are reputational risks that come with it, but this is kind of something that our board has appetite for. We're focused on sustainability. I'll talk more about sustainability a bit farther later on the presentation. And I will also aim for local ownership. There's no point, I think, for us to fund projects that is not embedded into whatever we're trying to change. And obviously that's very difficult, because I think the easy thing is to fund, I mean, World Bank to do things, but World Bank has its own, big international organizations, there are benefits of working with them, but also there are benefits of working with small organizations that are localized. And obviously there are capacity issues. And so we actually have a different approach to this. We're committed to field building. We're in for the long term. We believe in investing in leadership and in talent. So it's all about the people that we're investing in. And what we bring to the table is financial capital, so it's grants. We bring knowledge, so every single member of our staff has, you know, expertise in a specific field. I actually worked for many, many years in land use, and we kind of try to mobilize a lot of stuff around there. And we also, because of our connections, we bring political capital. We connect our grantees to partners, to government officials. And so I mentioned before, it's the long-term thing. And this is a little bit our due diligence process and the thinking around it. So the entry point when we think about the systems is thinking about the gaps and opportunities. So it could be through finance, it could be through capacity building, through policy windows. It really depends on the theme of what we're trying to do. And it's like I said before, it's all about the people. So we really select an entrepreneur, what we call policy entrepreneur, someone who's got a vision for a solution. And then we back them. So we give them funding, we give them back office support, and then, you know, then that's the whole, and we go in for the long term. So we co-design strategies with them. We engage very closely throughout the lifetime of the program. It's a lot of partners are not very familiar with this approach, so they find us quite intervening sometimes. But it's kind of the nature of getting CIFS funding. And I think just to channel our principal as a hedge fund, he's an active shareholder, so he expects us to be an active foundation. We can bring other funders when we identified a theme that we build coalition around the specific themes. And I think what's more important, which differs us from other foundations, is depending on organizations, we actually take board seats. So we give them core grants and we sit on the board, and we help them fix their operational back office, and sometimes fire CEOs if we have to. So this gives you a bit of an oversight of how the program, the climate program, ramped up. You can see that we had a very, very quick growth process. And I think in 2014, 2015, that's when we sort of plateaued a little bit more. And that's kind of in line of post, Copenhagen, and then how we started with an energy program. So energy is, if you see the blue bar, that's the energy program. Then the urbanization program kind of followed. And then land use is the newest. We focus in a couple of geographies where there are biggest mitigation potential. I forgot to mention something which is really important, which is we only focus on mitigation because we believe that the well below 2 degrees is still possible. We can have a lot of debate about whether adaptation, mitigation, and I actually think that there's a lot of synergies, but just in terms of to keep us focused, it is about mitigation. And that takes us into geographies, which is very different to the geographies that we work on the children's program, because in the children's program, we work in Africa and Southeast Asia. And in the case of climate, we work in China, we work in actually Europe, because we're based in Europe. It's kind of our backyard, we have to work there. And we work in Latin America, and we also have global programs. So you can see on the slide, on the graph, the second graph is kind of how it's spread by geography, and the first one on top is how the different systems have, the grants and systems have evolved. So energy system, urbanization, land use. So I think this is my final slide, and I think this is where a lot of reflection. So our climate change program, in a way, I would say that if I call it phase 1, is post-Copenhagen until Paris. And there is a lot of lessons learned, and we're in a quite intense reflection point. And actually, the head of climate is now the CEO of a foundation. So I think there's something that we did, or she did in her strategy that worked, that in a way we are trying to replicate across the rest of the foundation. I think one of the biggest questions for us is, when do we exit? What is a responsible exit? And so I'm going to use an example, which is MAPS, mitigation, action, planning, and scenarios. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a stakeholder-driven climate model exercise. It's a partnership between South Africa, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. This program took 7 years, and we mobilized around $15 million. So we had CIFS money, we have the Swiss Development Agency came afterwards, CDKN joined. We also, in the case of Brazil, had Santander Bank to support. And the theory of change initially was just like, wow, if you engage with, if you do a multi-stakeholder process, you can have a more robust model exercise. And as we went through, the lifetime of grant, and back then when we supported, I joined CIF halfway, so I don't have the historical perspective of it. But in the beginning, it was seen as a very high risk and very high return. And we didn't actually know that we were going to have a Paris kind of framework. We just thought that that's something that we had to do. And throughout the lifetime of, it was a 7-year program, and we had to go back to the board to ask for money a couple of times. They almost killed the grant a couple of times because it's really difficult to explain something like this without a really clear endpoint. And also at the same time, you're saying, what is your, how do you measure contribution and attribution? Like in the case of service delivery, which we do on the children's side, but like if you distribute X number of medicine or X number of mosquito nets, you can track the attribution there. but your impact is very, very localized. When you move into advocacy, when you move into research, evidence-based policy making, it's very, very diffused. There's a lot of things that can happen in the middle, you know, that will achieve what you want to. And what we can also, when I mentioned before, it's about policy change, but ultimately what we really care about is greenhouse gas emission reduction, right? So there is a really, really long causal chain. And for us, it's really difficult to kind of put our finger and know what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And so the maps really suffered with this kind of our need to know that we're making a country, there is an attribution, but also at the same time kind of knowing that it's a long-term thing. So, and I think that the issue with success and sustainability is pretty central, because ultimately what we care about is greenhouse gas emission reduction. How do you define success within the lifetime of the grant? Because the grant just finished because it ran up until Paris. And you know, the idea was to help inform the debate, the NDC of the 4 Latin American countries. And we also know, we did a third-party evaluation. So that's kind of something that SIF does. In every single grant, we have a third-party evaluation because we want to learn and try to course correct throughout the process. Is initial findings, you know, you can ask me 5 years from now. The fact that we embedded the research process into the national academic institutions is that there is the same methodological approach is now being applied in other sectors after the program has finished. That is sustainability, but that's not really linked to climate. But there is this capacity, this knowledge base that we have helped to build in Peru, in Chile, in Colombia that was not there before. So I think defining success and sustainability is really tricky, and especially because we care about greenhouse gas emission, then how do you measure other kind of co-benefit that's not within the project? And ultimately, all we care about is how do we scale and replicate, because this program is really resource intensive. The number of people involved, the money that we have to put in, it's not, if we think that, you know, one of the, yesterday, the high level panels were talking about the long-term strategy that all the countries committed to do. If you really wanted to do a societal debate, that takes money and time and people to be prepared to go into kind of a modeling exercise to say, what are the assumptions we're talking about? How many jobs? What's the impact on people's job and all of that? And that the same approach on maps is not so easily replicable because it's really expensive, but that is actually the best way and the most sustained way to do. So one final point about country, it was really interesting that the funding that we got from supported on the maps on CDK, from CDK and the Swiss Development Agency, they couldn't fund Brazil because Brazil was already a middle income country. They have graduated. But Brazil actually is 50% of greenhouse gas emission in Latin America. So for us, it was a really no-brainer to go to Brazil, but then all the bilateral agencies couldn't go to Brazil because it's not politically, well, you know. So those are the challenges. I think we have a couple of lessons learned from this 7 years. It's all about the people and the trust that you build throughout the process. It's about the people who share the same vision. You will go through the thick and thins, through, you know, almost bored, canceling, then people maybe losing their job, and anyway, but that we have survived. It is about evolving theory of change. There is no static theory of change. We used to be really obsessed about theory of change, so that's the theory of change, and then we'll stick with it. And what we realized that when you know, the program runs on the floor, you deal with the politics, you deal with people's ego, you deal with lack of capacity and, you know, context change. And so we have to be open about changing the theory that we had initially. So I talked about the shared vision and direction of travel. And I think the final lesson that we have learned and is about being close to the ground and build a local capacity, because that's what's sustained. It's about the people who can then take, you know, the shared vision and take it forward after the grant has finished. And so, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I must say that being also myself an analyst of NDC development processes, the MAPS program really was a kind of gold standard for NDC processes. So I think, yeah, the trailblazing was definitely there. And even if you may have suffered during the way, in the end, the outcome was actually really impressive. So I will now pass on to Ian Cochrane. So Ian is with the I4C, the Institute for Climate Economy in Paris. So those of you who are longer in the process know that the research group at CDC Climat, which has now become an independent research institution. So Ian and his group have been working for quite some time once the technology is up and running.
Okay, oh, there's actually buttons this time. Everyone can, okay, yes, now you can hear me. So my name is Ian Cochrane. I'm from I4C, Institute for Climate Economics. We're a nonprofit research center founded by the Caisse de dépôt, the French Public Development Bank, and the AFD, the Agence Française de Développement, so the France's overseas development finance institution. I think I have the large task of trying to summarize the complexity of what is the green bond market and what can it actually do for the climate agenda and the development agenda. So I may have quite a number of slides that we may move through quickly, given that we're on day 10 of the COP, and I'm guessing all of you have been in at least one event with Sean Kidney or someone else who's been talking about green bonds. But I'd like to present some of the results from a report that we've done, which was supported by Crédit Agricole, EDF, and Mirova, where we've attempted to get at the heart of the green bond question of if this is an instrument that we're going to use to finance the transition, and when I say we, I also mean the public sector in terms of supporting and pushing its development, there are still two main sets of questions we need to look at. But before that, quick reminder of where we're going right now and what the challenge is. Won't go into details, but I think it's important to remember, I think as the other panelists have said, we do have a significant challenge, and thinking about how to finance this challenge has led to a lot of discussion around numbers. I think we're seeing new numbers today about how much the NDCs will cost to implement. But a key point from this is to remember, it's not just the total cost, it's actually the additional cost of doing development properly in terms of aligning it with climate change. So it's Article 21C from the Paris Agreement, where it's not about just finding more money, it's about how to reorient and redirect the funds that would be going into this business as usual development and getting it into climate related investments. So that means regulation. I actually kind of have to say agree with Anna in some of the approach. Sometimes you do need regulation. You might need some lawsuits. You might need a few pushes to get people going the right direction. But we're really talking about shifting. And when we do talk about shifting, we see, actually I don't have that slide, we see that in terms of the total amount of capital needed is not that great compared to the capital floating around in global markets. My president of our association can correct me, but if I remember, annual bond issuance in general is in the billions, trillions. So we're really talking about money that's out there right now. It's just how do we create economic models for projects and for investments and policy frameworks that move it away from this traditional approach and get it into the projects that we need to address the climate challenge and more broadly, the development challenge. So this is a quick excerpt from work that we're doing at I4C where we're tracking domestic climate investment. And so each year we've been looking at what is the total climate related investment in France. We look at who are the project developers that are doing this. Are they public actors? Are they private actors? And then if you see far to this side, so the left on as you're looking at it, how do we begin to link those investments and the people that are doing them with the sources of capital, whether public, international, commercial banks, household savings, et cetera. And so we've started to, we've started as many other research centers around the world. We ran an event on this at the beginning of the COP, looking at the different instruments that are beginning to link these sources of capital and to the project developers. And of course, there's a lot of different instruments, whether public grants, subsidies, concessional debt, or just your plain old vanilla commercial market rate debt and different forms of investment. But the one that we've seen getting the most discussion these last couple of years is green bonds. And that's because it appears to be something very new. It appears to be something that's increasing very, very rapidly. And we can put very big numbers behind the total issuance, et cetera. And I think it's important to look at this market. It's important to begin to dissect it and say, what are we really talking about? Because green bond is a very generic term. We're talking about corporate bonds. We're talking about sovereign bonds. We're talking about asset-backed securities. We're talking about development banks issuing capital, issuing bonds just to raise capital. So these are very different actors that are actually using this tool in very different ways and with very different, sorry to use different so many times, implications both for transparency questions, but also questions about what is the real additionality of this financing. So this is the focus of the report, and there's a few copies of the executive summary in the back of the room. I see some people have already grabbed it, thank you. We decided to sit down with a couple of actors in France who are very active in this area and think about how do we begin to unlock this full potential of green bonds to facilitate the reorienting of capital, but also ensuring that we have environmental benefits and we have financiality. And I'm not talking about CDM financial additionality. What I'm really talking is about it helps those who can't get access to money today be able to access the capital they need to do new investment. So these are the questions we asked. Given the time constraints, I'll run through this relatively quickly, but we identified two key areas, and one of them is what I think Axel has specifically asked me to speak about today, is this idea of ensuring the environmental integrity of underlying assets. There is a risk of greenwashing. We are seeing a market-led process with very little harmonization. I mean, we see convergence, but not necessarily harmonization in terms of what do we define as green, who's defining it, how does that process happen? Is it when we issue the bond, is there ex post reporting in terms of what proceeds were actually used for? And so there's a lot of questions there, but we do see that there are a lot of, and so I may sound a little negative about it, but I will say that green bonds are an important tool. We see benefits, and if used properly, we do see that this helps issuers communicate on sustainability strategies, on what they're doing in terms of contributing to the low carbon transition. Again, this is now regulation in France with Article 173 in terms of what all financial and corporate actors have to report on. We see this for investors. They're able to identify those assets they want to have in their portfolio if they are actively managing the green content. That's not everyone. That still is a very small part of the investment community, but it still gets that information out there that's necessary to do it. And finally, if we take the public perspective, and I would actually group the philanthropic community into that public perspective because there is a mandate. They are following a mandate to support a policy agenda. We also see that this is a tool that can help the public sector identify investments to support and to scale up. Because again, we are providing more information about what we are doing with funds. But as we see this market moving forward, we need to start thinking about and managing this expectation gap in terms of what issuers might be saying is the green impact and the green value of their the paper they're issuing, and what is the reality. And I think the key point here is trust. And what does the investor and the issuer community need in order to trust each other? And how can the public sector begin to facilitate that process, even though they won't be the only actor? Because in the end, it's about ensuring the information and the trust is there so that we don't have any type of systemic risks within the market. If there is some type of headline risk, that we identify major greenwashing that could impact the trust, public perception in general. And so within our report, we've laid out a couple of ideas, and we've traced some of the both market-led and government-led initiatives to attempt to look at this transparency and enhance these transparency benefits around the greenness, whether we're talking about the Climate Bonds Standards Board, who's putting together the science-based approach to looking at definition questions, very important, almost market-led initiative, or we're looking at the Green Bond Principles, who are not looking at definitions, but rather looking at process. How should the green bond, how should that actually occur in practice as we move from an idea to actually issuing bonds on the market? We also see from our perspective that there might be a role for governments. It's not clear exactly who has that mandate to actually regulate in terms of the definitional questions, given that this is tends to be a market-led, a market that is definitely being driven by the private actors within it, although there are a number of public development banks as well as governments. France will be emitting a sovereign green bond soon. But we do need to think about, is there a role for the government to play in ensuring that green component and the different ways that that can occur? And for us, that needs to probably be linked to the second part of what I want to talk today, is the financial additionality, in the sense of it's not just ensuring that this is a green market, but are any of the bonds that we're counting in this 46 billion last year new finance? Or these things that would have just been floated as bonds on the market in any case, and green or otherwise, they would have been fully subscribed at exactly the same financial terms. And the evidence is actually indicating that is the case, that most of what we see in terms of issuance today would have happened in any case. And while we might have a faster, fully subscribed bond, we might see a diversification in terms of who is subscribing to the bond. These projects and these actors would not have had much of a difficulty in terms of accessing capital. So now the question on the other hand is, do we need to see a role for the public sector in terms of ensuring that those that can benefit from this instrument actually are beginning to partake? And that opens a window as well for the financial, for the environmental integrity piece. Because if there are public incentives, that means there is a role for the public actors to come in and say, these are the standards that must be met, these are the definitions that must be used. So I can't comment too much on this graphic because I've stolen it from a report I have not had the time during the COP to fully read, but I think this clearly illustrates, it's a study that BlackRock has just put out, well, I guess it came out November 2015, but I just discovered it in someone else's slide during the COP. But what we really see, which is very interesting, is that if we look at most of green bond issuance, it is in the AAA, it is in government, it is in these big companies and actors that are really not having too much of a difficulty accessing capital and floating bonds in general. So now we're really confronted with, how do we get it to the startup companies? How do we use bonds to get it to companies that are exploring new technologies that don't have a high credit rating? There is no past track record, so they're not going to necessarily have that trust factor from the formal financial institutions today in terms of being able to raise their capital. How do we begin to address these issues, and in terms of also pushing institutional investors to see these potentially more risky forms of bond issuance as actually part of this broader green and climate action narrative that they should begin to participate in? And so I think we'll be hearing from others on the panel today about what type of public support schemes we could see. On our end, we've explored, and there's a couple discussed in the paper, in terms of thinking about, is there a space for public actors or philanthropic actors to help cover that added cost of a green bond? So doing some of the transparency work in terms of second opinion reporting and some of the report, covering the cost of that reporting over the life of the bond. Can we begin to link this with broader financial market questions, such as capital adequacy ratios and some of these very more macroeconomic prudential rules issues, where we could see a space for creating financial incentives for bond issuance? But I'd like to end just on this idea of the AAA rationale for public intervention. Please excuse the financial sector pun on the last day of the COP. But when we are starting to talk about these public support schemes, and I think it's also when we're talking about philanthropic support for this market, there are three areas we need to think about. One is alignment. Are we able to create a green bond system that actually starts channeling new and additional capital, whether in direct investment or refinancing, that's aligned with national or international low carbon resilient development strategies? This access question again, does this help to expand financing for eligible underrepresented or underfunded activities? So not just the big players we already see very much active in the market. And then again, this additionality of really saying how to also ensure this money is going to those investments that do have the most both short-term mission reduction potential and resiliency increasing potential, but also the middle and longer term, particularly when we think about that climate is not, it is something that's going to be a long haul issue that we need to start thinking about now. So I have the yellow card, and this is my last slide, so I will stop there. And thank you again very much.
Thanks a lot, Ian, and also for pouring some water in the wine, which is sometimes a bit too sweet, of the green bond community. We now come to Danielle Rossetto, who is working with Climate Mondial and who has been developing that for the context of actually saving part of the CDM pipeline through a green bond kind of approach. I'll just get your slides up.
Thank you on that. It's anything but aimed at saving the CDM. I'll go through actually a couple of key points relating to, here we go, the reason why we're developing the Paris climate bonds. But just to give you a bit of background, it's essentially a partnership between Climate Mondial and Baker & McKenzie to develop a Paris climate bond concept, in which we're also partnering with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and in fact our partner Grant Kirkman apologises, and I take his place today to give this outline. And it's something that we've worked on for perhaps the last year and a half or so, going back to the Investor Summit on Climate Risk in January in New York City, where it was first, the concept was first launched with Cristiano Figueres. Then we also discussed it at the SB 44 meeting on funding the CDM through international financial institutions. It was also discussed and supported formally at the executive board of the CDM meeting in EB91. And to point out the concept, the Paris Climate Bond concept, is something that ultimately we would like to see everybody consider using and be available for use. And in that sense, the demonstration of the Paris Climate Bond is something where we are committed to publishing the template documentation and a best practice guide also on implementation, so that people all have the chance to adopt if it's suitable. And very much addressing some of the issues that Ian has mentioned. But just before I explain what the Paris Climate Bond concept is, let me just spend a bit of time saying what are some of the, let's call them market failures that exist today that this concept addresses. The first one is, we speak to institutional investors. I think Ian mentioned BlackRock and various others, pension funds, asset managers, and so forth. And there is a very strong desire to invest and to link investments to the Paris climate goals, the 2-degree goal. However, there is a tremendous absence of an investable asset class into which those institutional investors can actually put their money. Green bonds are about as far as it goes just at the moment, because, but unfortunately, green bonds, through various issues relating to their certification, measurement and verification, it's very difficult to conclude that they actually will help under the Paris Agreement. Second is we have governments with scarce financial resources seeking to raise $100 billion per year from 2020. Obviously, the Paris Agreement contemplates other sources of finance. So what we're looking to do is give governments a hand and offer a way to leverage private sector finance with public sector resources, and possibly also philanthropic resources, as we're here discussing today. Ian has mentioned the issues associated with environmental integrity on green bonds. And I think what we have noticed is that in the recent past, we've had the People's Bank of China and the Bank of England both issue guidance that says, look, when we're talking about additionality and applying it to green bonds, we must look at the additionality of the underlying projects, not the instrument as a whole. It's about the underlying projects. And then we also need a certain level of verification and possibly enforcement, ex post enforcement of the mitigation outcomes as part of that process. There needs to be also transparency, and there are, the regulators and investors are really looking for more information about the underlying use of proceeds. When we talk about a green bond, into what assets and operating projects are these funds being invested? And finally, we need scalability more broadly. So this cannot be, we cannot get caught into this single transaction type mentality. And in fact, institutional investors themselves will tell you that they need to find this asset class which is repeatable, and there's a big volume and there's a secondary market for these assets, and then everyone can then begin to invest. So just to give you a brief idea, speaking about project finance today, we have a tremendous, if we look at the topic of renewable energy investments in emerging markets, you know, Ian mentioned, I'm not sure if you mentioned the actual number, but people are quoting something near $80 billion US dollars worth of issuance of green bonds in this year alone. And the unfortunate reality is that very little of that is actually north-south. So we talk about the Paris goals. Very little of that money is going from developed countries into developing. And if we look at specifically at project finance in emerging markets today, what we find is that if you're able to get a project banked, you generally have ex-ante project finance allocated with some sponsor equity and debt, which generally lasts the full duration of the project, which can be 15 or 20 years. So that is, the lenders are pricing margins that incorporate things like construction and development risk. This is everything after financial close. And so we don't have a way today of, after projects having been de-risked, operating for 1, 2, 3 years, ability to refinance, to come down to a much lower cost of capital. And so the Paris Climate Bond seeks to achieve a structure whereby projects, emerging market renewables projects, are able to refinance themselves after commercial operation. And in that sense, so what this structure is about is taking that 70% or thereabouts of debt and allowing these projects to refinance that debt by bringing the bond markets into emerging markets. And in that sense, it necessarily involved the creation of an investment trust, because as Ian mentioned, a lot of the bond markets are exclusively reserved for, if you like, credit-worthy entities. We can't, there's no way for smaller entities that aren't in the bond markets already to access, you know, these markets. And so we create an investment trust. And this is very important. This is where the public finance comes in, because we also have an element of first loss protection to that trust, which is provided by public sector resources or philanthropic resources if they're so disposed to doing so. And in this sense, the investment trust issues a bond, which we call a Paris climate bond, and then the projects that are refinanced, all to be eligible for this structure, must be registered with current or future mechanisms under the UNFCCC. So for today, there's only really one option, and that's CDM, but we certainly wouldn't exclude that other mechanisms such as Article 6 could become part of this. This is the other thing which is very, very important to point out, is that because of the registration with the CDM, and I know that Axel spoke briefly before about the fact that, Green Climate Fund and so forth is proposing that people cancel their CERs if they receive climate finance under the GCF. Well, this is very important because for the time being, if we don't cancel the CERs, it's entirely possible that the CERs can be sold for another party to offset their emissions. And so what we don't get is a net reduction in emissions. So the mitigation benefit that we certify under the CDM is then given to somebody else to allow emissions to increase. So when it comes to climate finance, it's absolutely crucial for the time being that we do have cancellation. And thankfully, the voluntary cancellation platform has already been established and can be used in cases of climate finance. The other thing which is very important is that projects which come in to this facility quoting a certain level of mitigation on an ex-ante basis can actually have that mitigation enforced. In other words, there are contractual mechanisms, because ultimately this is a loan to refinance debt on those projects, is that underperformance can be actually enforced. Just a couple of issues, and I've just been issued a yellow card for presumably a cheap foul. So I'll try not to speak for too much longer. But some of the issues as we work through are listed here. I won't speak too much more about that, given that I'm now on a yellow card, but certainly encourage questions that relate to this. And I think what we'll hope to see is demonstration of this concept during the course of next year, and the publication, importantly, of the guide and also the template documentation, which we hope to see many others choose to adopt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for outlining this really interesting concept, and I hope that we'll have a good trial period and first cases to approach this in the couple of the next months. So we now have Jalil Bousidi, who is a financial sector expert with EMENA Advisory, and he will discuss a new concept that relates to the so-called climate policy performance bonds. I just need to get his slides up and running. There they are.
Yes, hello there. Many thanks for your time and being patient in this last day of the COP. And we know we are all tired, so I will try to be quite, let's say, quick and synthetic, and then we can have a debate. I will try to address some questions raised by my colleagues, Anna, Jan, and Danielle. They said, and they're true, that there's a lack of an investable asset class for institutional investors like pension funds, sovereign funds, insurance companies, and even banks. And everybody has in mind the Trump risk. What about the fact that it's just a promise, what has been maybe signed in COP21, and that the president-elect will not respect his engagement? So what could we do about this? Anna said also that people will only do think if there is policy. I agree on this also, and I will also say that people will only do this if there are metrics and measures. And Jan talked about the lack or the risk of greenwashing and the transparency problem. So how could we solve all these issues knowing that we are in the COP22, COP of action, COP of innovation? What can we do exactly knowing that climate change has gathered, and we all know this massive inertia as international efforts tend to be slow, there's and inefficient and maybe even bureaucratic. There's a huge need for speed, maybe even for quantum leap. And we all know this. So what can we do exactly to move maybe from NDCs that are interesting, but maybe only a high-level blueprint that is not certainly not transferable, easily transferable into actions or even investments. So we need to move from promises to actions. And Anna also explained that the risks are immediate. And even if we have models as the one I'm exposing here, telling that the costs on manageable assets by the end of the century, depending on the scenario, could cost something like $60 trillion. This is huge. This is a black swan. So how could we hedge this? And I am let's say, a capital market background guy, but I am also very sensitive to what you said about the risk for children and the risk for the immediate risk we are all suffering from. International Energy Agency just published notes saying that you have 6.7 million deaths, premature deaths, linked to air pollution every year. This is the 4th leading risk factors for deaths worldwide, air pollution. So this is an immediate risk. What can we do about this? What can we do to move very quickly from promises to actions? So the idea is quite simple. I know that you may be wondering if these pictures are real or if I have let's say a creative imagination. These are reals. These are reals. These are war bonds, and they have been issued in World War I, World War II, to finance the war. And just to give you some background, we talked about sovereign bonds. Do you know that the first national sovereign bond has been issued by the Bank of England by the end of the 17th century to finance war against France? I think that we all saw that, and we all agree that we are in a war against climate change. This is a war. So we need, let's say, a bold move, and maybe even if in the title of my presentation, and it's quite technical, we talked about climate policy performance bonds, but you can see this as sovereign war bonds, but war against climate change, not between us. So the idea is quite simple. Here is another, let's say, successful man who has also a foundation with a lot of money, and look at what he's saying. What gets measured, get done. The mere act of tracking key indicators makes it much more likely that changes in those indicators will be positive. So my idea is quite simple, and it's not my pure idea because I'm working with Professor Michael Mendeley, who is based in London, and he's not there today, so I'm talking for both of us. Our idea is to link public debt to environmental objectives. So we can take the example of France. We have been pushing for this, and we are really happy that the French government announced that they will issue next year the first ever sovereign green bonds. But we think this is not enough. Why? Because green bonds are project finance bonds. This will not solve the 2-degree or the 1.5-degree scenario. We need a more helicopter view, a more macroeconomic view. We need a more concrete plan and to move those NDCs to a more concrete action. So let's say that France announced that we will reduce by 40% CO2 emissions in 2030. Why not issuing a sovereign bond, a sovereign climate war bond, saying if with this contingency, with this environmental contingency, aligning financial and environmental objectives, if we achieve our target, if we are successful, we will pay you a little bit less than what we usually pay on the same maturity. And we have a pay for failure feature. If we fail, if we do not achieve our objective, we will pay you a little bit more. So now you see why I was talking about Trump. Because if you had the Obama administration issuing those bonds before Trump got elected, and if you are a pension fund or even a smart investor, maybe the founder of your foundation, you could have invested in such bonds. So generally, I have questions saying to me, okay, look, I don't know if you are familiar with social impact bonds. We rather prefer a pay for success feature instead of a pay for failure feature. We don't want to be short of the government performance. We don't want to be happy if the government fails and earn more money if the government fails. What I generally answer is that we all have insurance for our cars, for our houses. We pay some euros, dollars, or dirhams, but we do not expect that our house will burn in order to have a bigger amount of money. This is just a hedge. And you know that insurance companies will pay more and more premiums, more and more fees because of climate change. So such an instrument could be an interesting hedging tool for them because they will compensate the premiums they will pay to their clients thanks to a little bit more money. So we're working on this idea with Michael since a few years now. We have been pushing it in several conferences, several papers. And a month ago, you have a municipality, because this idea could be also applied by municipality, by corporate. We wrote a paper called Cracking the Volkswagen Case Thanks to NOx Bonds. We said, okay, Volkswagen, if you are serious about your plans, just issue bonds linked and indexed on the NOx emissions of your cars you are selling in Europe and in the US, and let's just pay more coupon if you fail to achieve your objectives. So what I was going to say is that now you have DC Water, who is a municipality managing, as indicated in the name, water in Washington, DC, that has issued the first ever environmental impact bond. So this is almost the same structure that we are suggesting here. It's, let's say, a green bond, but with an environmental contingency. It's backed by a green infrastructure, and you have two investors in this bond, Goldman Sachs and Calvert Foundation. So we were talking about philanthropy and foundation. You have a foundation investing in this asset. So this is not just theory. Right now, it's practical. You have now a bond that will pay you more depending on an environmental performance. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. So we've now heard a broad array of innovative ideas about financing through bonds and how philanthropies can be brought in, of course, with this leading example of multi-$100 million engagement. So I would now like to throw the floor open to questions from our participants. So you have the floor. Do we have a roving mic around that we could use? Good, the mic is coming, so just short, I have you. Please say your name and institution before asking the question.
Hello.
And
Hello.
bite
Hello.
the mic, otherwise it will not be loud enough.
Hello, my name is Kevin Sarah. I'm a project developer. What we've seen in the market, the biggest funding gap is actually develop, whether it be equity or philanthropy. And if we're really going to scale up, and especially in emerging markets, the biggest issue that people are having is finding the money to bring a project to maturity, to financial close, where you can bring in the bond, all the creative financing. But when you're in a project mode with no cash flow, the bond market doesn't work. And equity investors are really, there's not very many of them. You have emerging market risk, and then you have like this renewable energy risk and some of the new technologies. And then the other, a very similar funding gap is with startup companies. There's a lot of really neat technologies which can address lighting, for example, and then these are very difficult to finance because they need to be aggregated, and there are very clever ways of doing this. But it's all new technologies. They're all startup companies, and there's very, very little money. There are not investors out there willing to take the risk.
So any one of you would like to answer, Khalid?
Yes, thank you for your, you hear me? Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's very important, and I think that businesses need, do not like uncertainty. From a macroeconomic and political point of view, we all agree that clean techs and all renewable energies need political support because of the cost that is currently higher and still higher, except for some specific cases, especially when you have the price of the barrel of oil that is less than $50. So products such as climate policy performance bonds could help raising such uncertainty. And you can also imagine a startup, a clean tech with a high yield rating that is, let's say, for example, funding itself normally on a normal basis at 6 or 7% a year on financial markets, that could issue such a bond, backed on the green infrastructure and saying, okay, look, if I reduce, for example, by 100% CO2 emissions, then you will agree to finance me on a 3% or 4% basis. And then you can imagine that, for example, the European Investment Bank could give some, let's say, credit enhancement and guarantees to back such structures. I already had some discussions with them, and they said that they could agree on this. And maybe just the last idea, it's quite technical, but I will try to be as precise and clear as possible. I have another idea that is linked to your question, and this could be using, let's say, a climate premium when discounting the value of your project. If you have a project that will bring you $200 million in 20 years, generally when you compute the value as of today of these 200 million, you use the risk-free rate. This is government rate. You use a liquidity premium. You use the credit spread of the project, but you stop the climate premium. What I'm suggesting is to use a climate premium that will be higher for projects with bigger carbon footprint. So for a renewable energy project, this premium will be 0. And for a carbon capture project, the premium could be also negative.
Sorry. First we get the second answer, and then of course we also have to get other. So please.
Just to address exactly, you mentioned the topic bankability. If you look at climate finance as it's provided today by the various sources, by and large, it's provided as either a concessional loan or a grant. The majority of climate finance that you see today, and even the GCF, the majority of what they've done has been orientated towards these. Unfortunately, there's two problems with that. One of them is the leverage ratio is very low. You might get at best $1 to $5 of public to private investment from a concessional loan. You've also got the limitation that it needs to be found from public balance sheets every time. However, using climate finance to fund guarantees addresses your point about bankability, because what you could have is you can have investment guarantees or credit quality guarantees that allow banks to then lend against projects. It's a foreign exchange risk. How do you hedge if you're a US dollar or euro or pound denominated investor? How do you hedge that against the currencies into which you're investing? And climate finance just hasn't been used for this as yet. But as a recommendation, maybe to the negotiators, is to think seriously about using climate finance for various forms of market risk and credit risk guarantees to address the bankability issues that you raise. Because I agree with you, they're very, very important.
Just to kind of complement that real quick, I think that's why with the slide I tried to show is that particularly on this discussion of bonds today, this is just one instrument. And I think we need to really, everyone needs to realize this is not the panacea. So you do need other instruments and other approaches. And perhaps disconnecting this from the climate finance discussions, we do see this though in renewable energy and energy efficiency finance, transport finance, in some of the work we've done in OECD countries, looking at whether you can have a guaranteed initial loan that either that will be turned into a subsidy if the project fails, or transformed into a debt if it continues. We see also, for example, public development banks. And I think it's important here, this is one we can't just expect the international MDBs and the big development finance institutions internationally to play a role. We really need to start working with the in-country public and potentially private development finance institutions to put into place support systems for, as we have in France, for funding for the small and medium, sorry, I'm looking for the acronym in English, small and medium-sized private companies that are trying to do renewable energy projects, et cetera, et cetera. So we do see examples of these tools, and we need to start thinking more of an ecosystem of financial products and support to target the different phases of the project development scheme. And I think it's a very key point to bring in. And again, bonds are good mostly for refinancing, and or unless you're a major company doing an SPV, doing a very large scale project where you can know that you're going to have full subscription without a problem. So we need to be very clear about what instrument is correct for what context.
Thanks a lot. In the back, please.
Conrado Surber, Interandes, Lima, Peru. We work since 30 years in rural and regional development, and mainly in the Loreto region, the Amazonian River. I have two questions, one for Axel, it's more a personal one, and the other one for Sven. Being myself, well, the University of Zurich, my alma mater, I would like to know the link of your organization with the University of Zurich. That's a general question. And the relevant one, perhaps to Sven, had some insights into Optimus Foundation of the UBS Swiss bank some years ago, and their philanthropic view was to give away money just, and I think for the sake of a concept, of a financial concept, you have to interpret philanthropic or charity money as a very long-term loan with some return of any kind, because otherwise it corrupts the whole idea of a sound financing scheme. Thanks.
On the first question, well, I'm a researcher at the University of Zurich, so I'm heading a research group on international climate policy, having participated in 4th and 5th assessment report of IPCC, so that's the direct link. So, and on the second question, please.
It was more a remark about the concept of philanthropy per se. Didn't get really a question, but I support the view that it's a long long-lasting concept, the concept of philanthropy. It's not only about about financing. It's about well, it's about keeping and then further developing values. Just to give a quick example, it's not only about climate finance. What we have eyeing at is also of we have an example of ensuring, for example, patent rights for green technologies, that they can be put into a philanthropic foundation in order to save them of being bought away by big corporations for their own interests to keep their shares in the market. So it's a wider understanding, and we see that, and we also feel that when we speak to board members of philanthropic foundations.
Thanks, Sven. Patricia, please.
Yes, as I understand, green bonds have to be subsidized, otherwise people doesn't put the money in there, isn't it? That's my understanding. Perhaps I'm wrong. The fact is that there is also green bond principles to assure transparency reporting and the use of proceeds. Do you think that that could help to make them more robust, or which are the steps that needs to be taken to make green bonds more robust? Because I believe there's a definition from FTSE Russell Stock Exchange from London on low carbon activities, and there's another one from the Bank of China. So actually, how is this going to be managed, or how this could be? And the last question for Mr. Bozidi is, do you envisage that your idea could help to leverage funds for quick action before 2020, and how could you do it if you would have enough support?
Great, thank you so much. And I think I need to maybe, sorry if I wasn't clear enough. Today, the green bond market doesn't need to be subsidized, but the question is, do we want the green bond market to do more than it is doing today? And so if this needs to be a publicly, or a tool that is supposed to contribute to the public long-term climate investment beyond just signaling what companies are already doing, but really providing additional capital, then we do need to think about what's necessary. Because that means going beyond some of the dynamics of the market today, which is about ensuring that risks are managed, and it's actually asking financial actors to support more riskier projects in their different forms of definition. But I think it's important to say there might be some space for future public support. On the definitional issues, the green bond principles, we definitely recognize this market-driven initiatives. It's very important because it is bringing and converging practice on issuance and talking about what is necessary to think about when a green bond is issued, reporting occurs, etc. But again, that is not a forum to necessarily determine what is green or not. And I think this is something where if we then jump back up to the UNFCCC Paris Accord type of outlook, in some sense, those definitions are going to be country-based. And that's an idea we're exploring in the sense that while these are international financial products, often they're linked to projects that are in a specific country, that if we're saying this is a tool to support NDC and climate action at the domestic level, we do have to say, what is that definition in each country? And that can be problematic because we do, as we all know from the 100 billion accounting discussions that have gone on for quite some time now, there are very different views on what should be counted and what should not be counted. And that becomes a political exercise where I think the financial markets have less of a role to play, particularly, again, if we are linking this to the use of public funds to try to improve access to capital for those that don't have that access today.
I'd like to answer that question as well in two respects. First of all, the CDM. What is the CDM? Most people would probably think of the CDM as being a method for allowing countries under Annex B to meet their commitments under the Kyoto Protocol and a means of offsetting emissions under the European Emissions Trading System, which are both true. However, the CDM is also a lot more. And let me start by explaining that the green bond principles and virtually everybody in the green bond market cannot come to a conclusion about what is green, let alone how do you establish a baseline and how do you measure and verify the impact, the mitigation impact or adaptation impact of those investments. So, but when you unpack the CDM, and what I'd maybe like to ask everybody to do today is to think about the CDM as being its constituent parts, not just the offsetting mechanism or the mechanism that results in people meeting their mitigation targets under Kyoto, because it also contains criteria for establishing additionality. It includes criteria for local stakeholder consultation, for getting national letters of approval to certify that projects are in accordance with the SDG goals of this country. And it establishes practices for the ongoing measurement and verification, as well as the validation of projects with a whole panel of independent companies that can do this certification. Now, how is it possible that the green bond market wants to reinvent all of this? I cannot understand that. Hence, the Paris Climate Bond makes a serious attempt to address that by making use of everything that the CDM contains, as well as the things we all know it for under Article 12 of Kyoto. Second point you raised was about subsidies to green bonds. As Ian eloquently put, the green bonds today are not being subsidized, but if we want to align green bonds to NDCs and do much, much more, this is where we can think about rather than subsidizing, what we can say is we use climate finance, credit enhancements or partial risk guarantees on the bonds that allow, instead of having coupon rates or interest rates, if you like, that are quite high, we can lower them by 200-300, let's say, basis points, 2 or 3%, as a result of having these instruments in place. So I wouldn't call it a subsidy, but I would definitely say public support using climate finance to protect investors against the risks that the private sector at the moment cannot deal with, but using scarce public resources in a way that leverages much more from the private sector. So rather than use the term subsidize, I would say support, with the view, as Ian mentioned, to getting the green bond market to do more to contribute towards NDCs. This is very important.
Well, I couldn't argue more eloquently on what the CDM actually has achieved and why we have a body of experience that should definitely be brought into the climate finance world. And that's exactly breaking up the silos. We have now reached the end of our allotted time. And so I think
Can I answer just very quickly? There was a question for me. 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's very important. I think, yes, you can leverage quick action on the 2020 maturity, for example. Let's take, and you are raising the key question of statistics and measures. Take the example of Oslo. The city of Oslo has a very aggressive plan to reduce by 50% in 2020, 50% the GHG emissions. I had a discussion with the person from the city of Oslo who presented this plan in the Low Emission Solutions Conference. And I asked her, what about measures? How could you measure statistics of CO2 in the Oslo air? And what is the lag, the time lag? She said to me, we have a 2.5 to 3 years lag. So how can you do this with the 3 years lag if the statistics that you have as of today are the ones that you have in 2013? So we have the same problem in a lot of developed countries, but we have to work on this. And if you issue such bonds, you will be obliged to publish statistics more frequently. And you have the case of the Netherlands, who are very good. The CBS, the Bureau of Statistics of Netherlands, is publishing a quarterly bulletin, a quarterly review of all CO2 emissions, and is correlating them to GDP growth. And I don't know if you know this, but the case of Netherlands, we talked about lawsuits, has been, the government of Netherlands has been condemned by the justice of Netherlands to increase its CO2 emissions reductions from 17% to 25% in 2020, arguing that the interests of future generations are not taken enough into account. So yes, issuing a bond, as the one I suggested on a 2020 basis with the good measures, could be a very good option.
So thanks, Jalil, for again reinforcing the need for good MRV procedures, but because without that, all this will indeed be just be greenwashing. So I would like to thank the panel for the interesting contributions. I wish you a good journey back, or those who stay for the final long night of the negotiations, good stamina tonight. Thank you very much. Well, everything will be posted on UNFCCC website as usual after the side events that Liechtenstein and University of Zurich are doing. Thank you.